Hello, I'm Greenbrier Almond. I'm the son of Dr. Harold David Almond, and today I'm reading The Stories of a West Virginia Doctor by Dr. Almond. I'm reading Part 8, The Stories of Dr. Cunningham. 65 years of doctoring. During my 40 years of practice in Buchanan, I came to love the West Virginia hills. I traveled throughout 3 or 4 counties making house calls and getting acquainted with back roads and strong, good-hearted people. One of my favorite spots in all of West Virginia is the little town of Pickens. This charming town, nestled high in the mountains, about 35 miles from our home in Buchanan, is the snow capital of West Virginia. It has the distinction of having more snow recorded at its weather station than any other of the state's 77 stations. Not only did I enjoy Pickens for its charming scenery, I came to greatly admire the people who lived there. One of the citizens I admired the most and had the privilege to call my friend was Dr. James L. Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham, a physician in Pickens for 65 years, lived to be 102 and a half years old. At the time of his death in 1965, he was the oldest doctor in the United States. I met him early on in my practice and was his doctor the last 4 years of his life. As a young doctor, I marveled at his life's experiences and his extensive knowledge of medicine. James Cunningham, born in 1863, became a school teacher at the age of 18 and taught for 7 years in Hacker Valley. In 1888, he determined to go to medical school. In 1891, he graduated from Baltimore University Medical School. He returned to West Virginia after graduation, and in 1894, he married Mary Roberts and built a home in Pickens. During most of his 65-year practice, Dr. Cunningham was the sole physician in his town. He also served as a doctor for the families in Helvetia and Hacker Valley. He sutured their lacerations, dispensed their medications, treated their polio, pneumonia, flu, and typhoid, and even became their dentist when necessary. Dr. Cunningham had all the problems of any doctor in practice with the worries of his patients. Each patient's ailment was a diagnostic case, sometimes being solved at the moment, but other times requiring studying and reading. This was not easy without a hospital, x-rays, telephones, modern roads, or a laboratory. But until his eyesight began to fail at about 101, Dr. Cunningham tried to keep up with his medical study and reading. His only request for Father's Day in 1963, the year he turned 100, was a new medical textbook. Aside from doctoring Dr. Cunningham, he found time to take on many other civic duties as a school board representative, weather observer, agricultural advisor, census taker, railroad surgeon, poll worker, and friend to all residents, especially children. He planted more corn than his family could use each year so that the older children of Pickens could have a secret corn roast each summer. He convinced farmers in his area to use lime on their land. He believed everyone should receive an education and was able to get new schools built for the residents of his community. Dr. Cunningham traveled the area on foot, by horse, by rail, scooter, and train, and he had one of the first Model Ts in the territory. He usually had 3 horses so that he could rotate them when one got tired. He wore out, or at least outlived, 14 horses that he rode over the 3,900-foot Turkey Bone Mountain Trail to the little villages of Newland, Czar, and Jericho. His daughter Mabel remembered one particular cold, snowy night when her father returned from a house call on his horse. He was frozen to his horse and needed her assistance to get out of the saddle. Remarkably, Dr. Cunningham delivered 3,600 babies at home and never lost a mother. Statistics are dull figures, to be sure, but if the average home delivery is over 8 hours, Dr. Cunningham must have worked 10 years on an 8-hour day, 7 days a week, just to accommodate old Dr. Stork. They made doctors stronger in Dr. Cunningham's day. He delivered his last baby when he was 94 years old. Dr. Cunningham provided extraordinary care for the patients, as he was shown by the low 2% mortality rate of his 1,300 typhoid patients and his excellent care of patients in the 1930 flu epidemic. He believed that any success he may have had during his long and fruitful years as a physician at Pickens was due to the help of his many friends, his dear wife Mary, his daughter Mabel, and to the Almighty. Dr. Cunningham treats a leper. In 1906, Dr. Cunningham gained notoriety in the state and in the nation when he took care of George Rashid, a construction worker who had contracted Hansen's disease, better known as leprosy. Mr. Rancid, a Syrian immigrant, was working for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company in West Virginia at the time the leprosy was discovered. Without medication available to cure leprosy in 1906, the disease caused panic among all railroad workers. The only treatment for lepers was to place them in remote isolation. After the Syrian government insisted, President Teddy Roosevelt ordered the B&O Railroad to get medical care for Mr. Rashid. The company transported the patient in a railroad boxcar to the end of the line at Pickens, West Virginia. The only supplies the B&O sent were a revolver and a tent. Dr. Cunningham, never exhibiting fear for his own life, provided humane treatment for his patient. Little was known about leprosy treatment in 1906. In fact, Dr. Cunningham was the only doctor in West Virginia who ever had a leper as a patient. Even today, with drugs such as promine, rapamycin, and clofazimine available for the treatment of leprosy, the disease still carries the biblical stigma of unclean. Hopefully, with the leprosy bacilla now being grown in the footpads of nude mice and in the abdomens of armadillos, a vaccine will be developed in the near future. Despite the fear and stigma attached to leprosy, Dr. Cunningham displayed remarkable compassion and professionalism in his treatment of Mr. Rashid. Throughout his lifetime, Dr. Cunningham retained an interest in the treatment of leprosy. Even when he was over 100 years old, he would frequently ask me, "What's new in leprosy?" An important big toe. Before Dr. Cunningham sat a 14-year-old farm boy from up the mountainside of Pickens. He had been scying on his father's farm in order to cut the filth. The scythe had hit a snag, and the boy nearly cut off his big toe. It was 1906, long before antibiotics, so Dr. Cunningham scrubbed the foot and toe very well. He approximated the bone and severed the fascia with absorbable gut. He sutured the muscle, approximated the nerve and artery, and sutured the skin with silk. All instruments and sutures had been previously autoclaved in his steam autoclave. He applied a wooden splint to keep the bone edges in opposition. The bone in the toe healed in 6 weeks, and the boy had no infection. Frank Farrakhan, the 14-year-old boy who had his severed toe reattached in Dr. Cunningham's office, graduated from Pickens High School a few years later and attended West Virginia Wesleyan College in 1911. 2 years later, he matriculated to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. He passed the physical exam for admission to the academy and graduated 4 years later. That Pickens farm boy became Admiral Ferrion. Frank Ferrion was fortunate to grow up in Pickens, a small community located 36 miles upstream from Buchanan. This young man would never have passed his physical to the Naval Academy and never became an admiral unless he had all his toes in good working order. Dr. Cunningham was a miracle worker that day when he repaired the 14-year-old's severely cut big toe. Incidentally, Frank Ferrion's grandfather, who had settled in Pickens after the Civil War as a surveyor, was the cannoneer who shot the first cannonball fired in the first land battle of the Civil War. That cannonball was fired at Philippi, West Virginia. The cannonball shattered the leg of a Confederate soldier named James Edward J.E. Hanger. After his leg was shattered, Hanger went back to his dad's farm in Virginia and moped about. Then one day he cut out a peg leg from a piece of apple wood. He made such a good peg leg that other soldiers with amputations wanted one like his. Today, the J.E. Hanger Company is one of the world's largest companies specializing in making prostheses. Operating underwater. In 1908, Dr. Cunningham demonstrated his great medical skills when he was required to be an orthopedic surgeon, the nurse, and the anesthetist. One cool morning in May, a train railroad transporting logs from Hacker Valley to Pickens on the main line of the B&O Railroad crashed through a wooden bridge over the Buchanan River. The tram pinned the fireman under the water. A fellow railroad man lifted the fireman's chin above the water, and another worker ran to wake up Dr. Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham listened to the details of the accident and then grabbed his sterilized instruments and his chloroform bottle. He rode his horse down to the site of the accident. Dr. Cunningham looked over the situation and knew that an immediate operation was necessary to save the fireman's life. The doctor poured the chloroform, he threaded the needles, he applied the blood pressure cuff to shut off the blood supply to the injured leg to control the bleeding. As the anesthesiologist, he anesthetized the patient with chloroform, with a drip. Every 10 minutes or so, he added 10 more drops. He then took the role of the surgeon and walked into about 18 inches of water to proceed with the operation. He tied off the femoral artery and vein, then cut and used the gigly saw to amputate the femur. Finally, he pulled the patient out of the water, up on the sheet, and sewed the muscle and the fascia together. Chloroform is an excellent anesthesia, but the doctor must be careful. If a patient gets too much chloroform and stops breathing, his heart has already stopped. It is a tricky anesthesia, but that is what Dr. Cunningham used successfully up there in Pickens. Even in many home deliveries, he never lost a mother. While Dr. Cunningham was a patient in 1961 at St. Joseph's Hospital, he told us younger doctors his story of the railroad fireman. "Did the man live?" I asked. "Why, yes. I saw him around Pickens the next 10 years. Right after his amputation healed, I went to my apple orchard and made him a peg leg." "Why applewood, doctor?" I asked. "Apple doesn't expand when it gets wet and doesn't contract when it dries out," he told me. Dr. Cunningham always amazed me with his common sense and practical knowledge of how to solve medical problems. Dr. Cunningham's 100th birthday. When Dr. Cunningham turned 100 years old in September 1963, he was the oldest living physician in the state of West Virginia and one of the most famous citizens. He received birthday greetings from President John F. Kennedy, U.S. Senator Jennings Randolph, U.S. Representative Harley Stikers, American Medical Association President Dr. Annis West Virginia Governor W.W. Barron, and Naval Admiral Frank Farallon. His life history was featured in the American Medical News. The Pickens farm woman and his patients' friends gathered on his hillside home office, which also served as a library and a pharmacy, to honor their beloved doctor. Also helping him celebrate were the first patients he ever delivered in 1894, and the last patient he had delivered only 6 years before, when he was 94 years old. I was there on that September day to help Dr. Cunningham celebrate too, but I had personally honored him several months before his official birthday during a snowstorm. In 1963, Governor Barron decreed that every West Virginian who turned 100 years of age that year would receive 100 roses on Valentine's Day. You see, the state of West Virginia also turned 100 years old in 1963, and the governor knew that the personal delivery of those roses would be a good public relations event for the state. What the governor hadn't counted on was delivery into the snow capital of West Virginia in the middle of February. Over 200 inches of snow fell during the winter of 1962 and 63. On Valentine's Day, the state police from Elkins couldn't get through the snow up the four mountain roads between Mill Creek and Helvetia. Coincidentally, on February the 14th, I got a telephone call from the Pickens telephone operator to come up there to see a sick baby. She told me that I could make it through the snow in my Jeep, and she told me too about the 100 roses that had been promised but couldn't be delivered. Shirley, the daughter of a cousin of Lois, who was also a second-year nursing student at West Virginia University, was visiting our home that week. I asked her if she would like to make a house call to Pickens. She enthusiastically agreed. We traveled through the snow to see the sick baby in Pickens. Afterward, we visited old Dr. Cunningham at his home on the hill. I had brought 1 rose, all I could afford, and asked Shirley to pin it on Dr. Cunningham's lapel. He asked us about the storm and thanked us for coming to see him. My little Jeep felt 10 degrees warmer on the trip home that night. I was proud to help the governor honor such a great physician on that snowy Valentine's Day. A poetic tribute to Dr. Cunningham, written in 1972 by his neighbor, Reba M.B. It was in the year of 1881 that Doctor settled near our town. He came here with his parents. There were very few people around. He first became a teacher and taught the Golden Rule. He was also a census taker, then went to medical school. For years he traveled on a horse, went out in snow, sleet, and rain. He used a speeder and a motor car, and sometimes he rode the train. In later years, he bought a car in which he made his calls. Our country roads were very rough. He didn't seem to mind at all. He delivered 3,600 babies, and he helped save many lives. He also cared for the leper that is buried at the Y. He was a dedicated doctor. He was ready at a call. He took care of many people. Sometimes his pay was small. He worked well past 90 and still looked very young. He lived to be 100, yes, 101. In 1894, he married Mary Roberts and had 2 daughters so dear. Their names were Mabel and Ethel. They lived here on the hill. They were always very kind and helpful and helped until the end. They always thought of others. They were very grateful friends. They will always be remembered for their deeds and acts of cheer. We will always think of them and feel that they are near. This concludes the reading of the book, The Stories of a West Virginia Doctor by Harold Almond, M.D.